Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, and it's a very important event today and a personal pleasure to introduce Jason Furman on his new paper, What the Federal Reserve Should Do Now. He's elaborating views that he and others have been developing for some time, and in particular, in the ferment of his interactions with Peterson colleagues and other colleagues, decided to set out very thoroughly a follow-up to his recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, which was more focused on Build Back Better, but on the critical question of what the Federal Reserve should be doing. In base, he's arguing that the Fed has the right framework, but needs to make a mid-course correction of its implementation to get inflation under control. We're looking forward to an ongoing discussion with Jason, but today he's going to present for about 25 minutes and has some lovely charts with thanks to the team. And I am just going to say a few words. Jason is a professor of the practice of economic policy, jointly at Harvard Kennedy School and Department of Economics, where he is the co-teacher of Ec 10, the famous first-year economics course. He's also, I'm proud to say, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, which he joined in January 2017, of course, following his 8 years of service as a top economic advisor for President Barack Obama, including as 28th chair of the Council of Economic Advisors from August 2013 to January 2017. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Jason held a variety of public policy and research posts. In public policy, he worked at both the CEA and the National Economic Council during the Clinton administration, and prior to that at the World Bank. In research, Furman was a senior fellow at Brookings and at the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, and has served as visiting positions at various universities, including a stint at New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Policy. He is, of course, also authored numerous scholarly articles and worked in periodicals, and has a PhD in economics from Harvard. Jason has been a valued colleague to us long before he formally joined the Institute, but we're delighted to have him joining in the discussion along with people like Joe Gagnon, Olivier Blanchard, myself, our board vice chair, Larry Summers, David Wilcox, and Karen Dinan, with his view on what the Fed should do next. Jason.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. I was actually going to list exactly the same set of people and talk about how much my discussions with colleagues at the Peterson Institute have informed what I'm going to be talking about with you today. Just want to give some context here. The economy is in better shape than I expected a year ago. I thought the unemployment rate would be higher than it is now. I thought the recovery would take longer. And that's even with the Delta variant. But we also have much higher inflation than I would have expected a year ago. And so we find ourselves in a situation not exactly where we thought we would be when the Federal Reserve came out with their new framework in August 2020. I broadly think it's the right framework. It addresses a really important and what is going to continue to be an important issue of the need for expansionary policy when you're at the zero lower bound. But the framework itself is based on data. The data has changed a lot, and the post-meeting statements the FOMC makes haven't changed nearly as much with the data. And so that's what I think really needs to change now, in part a recognition of a problem we hadn't anticipated, inflation of this magnitude, but in part a recognition that we've come further than we expected in terms of output and employment. So with that broad context, I will share my slides. The biggest point is that monetary policy should remain expansionary. There's nothing in my recommendation that isn't expansionary. It would be less expansionary than it is at the moment. By the way, it's been moving in the opposite direction. I'll talk about that. Any one of the following three are the reasons to recalibrate. The economy is getting closer to maximum employment. We don't know exactly what that is, but whatever it is closer now than it was 6 months ago. Monetary policy has de facto been loosening. I'll expand on this. And these two have gotten probably too little attention. Most of the debate has been about inflation is high and likely at least partially persistent. I believe that very strongly. I'll try to convince you as to why I believe that, but that's not the only reason. Any one of these three would necessitate a recalibration. I believe all three of them apply, so recalibration is especially important. Just to list what I think should happen: more realistic, balanced communications and forecasts. It's a committee, obviously, you can't control the whole committee, but certainly from the chair and from the Board of Governors. Being more clear about the dual mandate and how to respond to deviation shortfalls, tapering more quickly, and set a default of liftoff in 2021, but alter if inflation or employment are low. It's a lot of uncertainty now. We need to recognize that. So why does policy need to stay expansionary? We're 6 million jobs short of where we would have been absent the pandemic, give or take. GDP is 2.6 below trend, probably less below potential for a variety of reasons, but it's definitely short of where it should be. So everyone in this debate thinks that policy, not everyone, but most of this debate is different degrees of expansionary. But now let me talk about the three parts. The first part is we're closer to maximum employment. The unemployment rate in November was 4.6%. Last cycle, the Fed lifted off when the unemployment rate was 5%. It tapered when the unemployment rate was around 7%. Now, you may think that last time they tightened prematurely. I personally don't think this was a disaster. The next 5 years were a pretty spectacular period in terms of low and falling unemployment, inflation very close to their goal, and rapidly rising real wages, especially for the bottom quarter of workers. But again, maybe that was too soon, at least in hindsight. There's a number of reasons why nominal rates should go sooner than the last cycle. Real rates are much lower. That's because expected inflation is higher now. Inflation's higher, that's one of the Fed's goals. The unemployment rate is improving more quickly. No one's talking, or at least I'm not talking about lifting off with the unemployment rate at 4.6. If you lift it off in the first half of next year, there's a decent chance the unemployment rate might be 4.3, 4.2, who knows, maybe even lower. Job openings are much higher now than they were last time. So more of the unemployment now is a labor supply issue, people choosing not to take jobs, rather than even as late as 2015, it was a labor demand issue. And fiscal policy is much more expansionary. So all in, even if we weren't looking that much at inflation, we'd be saying, this is an economy that still has a ways to go, should still have expansionary policy, but it doesn't need to have full stop, pedal to the metal, absolute max out policy, or at least we don't expect it to by the first half of next year. The second point, which also I think has gotten too little attention in the debate, is that over the last year, while the unemployment rate has fallen and the inflation rate has risen, you'd normally say policy should tighten a little bit, or maybe stay the same. Instead, policy has actually loosened. The best way to understand how policy is loosened is that what matters most for the economy is the real interest rate. But business is borrowing money and it can repay it with dollars that are worth less in the future because of inflation. It's going to be able to borrow more expected inflation has risen. On the 10-year Treasury rate, one measure of real interest rates, is basically tied for the lowest it's been since the inception of these securities in the late 1990s. It's fallen more in the last couple of months. Goldman Sachs has a financial conditions index. It's my favorite one to follow, that brings in a mix of yields, equities, and other aspects of the financial system. And it has just continued to get easier and easier. All told, it's roughly as if the Fed cut interest rates by more than 1 percentage point over the last year. That is the de facto easing we've seen for policy. Now, the Fed does have, in some sense, a higher path for nominal interest rates now than a year ago. At most horizons, the Fed funds rate is expected to be about 50 basis points higher than what was expected last year. The market is pricing in interest rate increases in 2022 in a way that they weren't. But you look at financial markets and you use TIPS data for expected inflation. You use OIS swaps to get some expectation of what the federal funds rate will be in the future. A zillion caveats to all of this. There's a lot of assumptions going on about pricing of risk, liquidity. The Fed's playing a role here. But broadly speaking, it tells a pretty clear story that in November 2020, the real Fed funds rate was expected to be about -1. Now it's expected over the next year to be about -3.5. Look a couple of years ahead, the expected Fed funds rate is still expected to be in real terms a little bit lower. And this is because the higher expectations of the interest rate path have been swamped by even higher expectations for inflation. That's a de facto loosening of monetary policy. Some of the recalibration would just bring monetary policy back to where it was last year. And last year it was in a very expansionary setting, appropriately so. I'm going to spend the most time on inflation. This is where most of the debate has been. I do want to stress that the argument does not rise and fall with one's views of inflation, but I think it matters. The first is inflation is rising everywhere, but it is rising more in the United States than it is elsewhere. And some said that was because of the delay in reopening the euro area, but the difference between them is actually pretty constant at about 2 percentage points. That's annual rate, that's 4% cumulative. Euro area, you're looking a little bit more like base effects. The United States, you're looking a little bit more like excess. I like to look at the contributions to inflation. This is something the Council of Economic Advisors, many others have done. And back in April, May, and June, I didn't expect, and no one expected, that this type of vehicle price inflation was going to continue. Pandemic affected services were also temporarily elevated. This other category in the core CPI, the gray bars, they've stayed largely constant, and if anything, have increased. It's a pattern you've seen elsewhere. For example, the inflation has broadened out and the median CPI has risen. I certainly think, and the labels for the teams over the last year, I think people dividing into teams hasn't been the world's best thing to advance knowledge. The labels have been very confusing. I think that inflation is likely to fall. The question, though, is how much does it fall? From February to July, it was a 6% annual rate. It's going to fall to 4%, 3%, 2%. Those are very different numbers. Why do I think it's going to fall? The largest part of the fiscal expansion is over. Supply chains are going to continue to improve. There'll be a handoff from goods to services, and employment, I should say, at least will partially return. So I don't, I definitely think inflation will fall. The question is how much. A number of reasons why I expect inflation to remain elevated. The first is continued high demand. Why? One, people have more money than ever before. Two, fiscal policy this year, an additional $525 billion is still spending out from the rescue plan this year. It's a lot less than last year, but in absolute terms, that is still quite a lot. And then monetary policy matters, and it matters with a lag. The fact that monetary policy is more accommodative now means even a year, year and a half from now, that's going to continue to support demand. Second, supply will take time to return to normal. I don't fully understand what's going on in US labor markets. I've spent a lot of time staring at the data. It's clear to me some of it is the aging of the population. Some of it is some continued residual economic weakness. Most of it isn't easily explained. It's a combination of men and women, the combination of younger people and retirees. I expect people to come back over time. I think the lingering effects of COVID psychologically may be playing a big role here. I don't think this is a permanent resignation. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, I certainly wouldn't assume everyone's coming back in the next 6 months. Supply chains will also take some time to unsnarl. Third, the price of shelter and other services are likely to accelerate. We can point to cars and say that's going to go away. You have to look hard at shelter, look hard at airfare, hotels, healthcare, at least in the CPI, maybe not in the PCE. Tight labor markets, we have the highest quit rate ever. We have an indicator of unemployment relative to the number of job openings that is very, very low now, the lowest it's been in the 20 years we've been tracking the data. That's actually more predictive of core CPI than any other indicator of tightness. And tight labor markets also matter with a lag. They're going to continue to be putting pressure over the next year. And finally, faster, I should say nominal wage growth here, and higher inflation expectations. There's been a lot of debate over how seriously we should take inflation expectations. I am not sure how much they matter. I think they are generally overrated, but I'm not sure. I place some weight on them and would like to like to look at them. I'm just put numbers on a few of these. Here's the rent increases. The CPI is growing at about a 3% annual rate. There's a lot of private sources that are telling you numbers that are much higher. For methodological reasons, the CPI effectively records that with a lag. I'm not saying it's going up to 18%, but it's going to be going up, and it's going to be going up over a while. And then here, just to put numbers on it, is the record quits. And this indicator, which is one of my favorite for thinking about the tightness of labor markets, is as tight as it's ever been and should continue to put upward pressure. And here are inflation expectations, both consumer expectations high, the break-even high. I don't have time to go into the Fed's Common Index of Expectations. Let me just briefly say, though, it's a lagging indicator. The statistical construction means it's unlikely to pick up trend breaks in inflation expectations very quickly. So I'd look at the individual underlying data, not at that one. So what should the FOMC do going forward? The first thing is more realistic forecasts. Over this past year, I've been tracking the 2021 forecasts of the FOMC. And the thing about the 2021 forecast is when they, for example, did that in June, they knew inflation already in the first part of the year. And so all their forecast was a forecast of inflation for the remainder of the year. If you look at that June forecast, I can't remember, it was something like 3% for the year. I don't remember the exact number. That forecast only would have been true if inflation for the remainder of the year was something like 1.7%. So throughout this year, the FOMC has been implicitly predicting not even that inflation is going to asymptote down to 2, but that inflation is going to turn on a dime and be below 2. In September, they came out with a forecast that was only going to be true if the inflation rate for the remainder of the year was a 1.4% annual rate. Basically, they needed core PCE prints of 0.1 every month for the remainder of the year. More realistic forecasts, of course, there's lots of FOMC speakers. They have lots of forecasts. The Summary of Economic Projections itself is a strange beast that combines a variety of different views, but in general, shifting to speeches that are more about the balance of risk, not just trying to seize every argument that goes in one direction and dismiss the arguments in the other direction. I personally, if I had to bet on core PCE in 2021, I'd bet the number comes in between 3 and 4. I'm not asking you to believe my bet, the FOMC to believe my bet. They have much better information than I do, just asking them to be more balanced in the discussion. Second is to be clear about the dual mandate. And there's an interesting shift that happened from the framework to the dual mandate. The framework had the inflation objectives, said inflation and employment would generally be complementary. However, under circumstances where they're not complementary, which is the circumstance we're in right now, take into account employment shortfalls and inflation deviations. Both of those are magnitudes. There are numbers that could be large or small. The statements, and this is language identical in every statement from September of last year through the most recent meeting, is that liftoff won't happen until the economy is at maximum employment and inflation has risen and it's on track to moderately exceed. But essentially took what were continuous variables and put them into dichotomous variables. And it didn't envision and tell us anything about trade-offs between them. In theory, the statement says if you're 0.1% below maximum employment, but inflation's 20%, you still shouldn't lift off because you're still not there on maximum employment. Now that we're in a world of trade-off, I think it's very clear that the Fed needs to tell us that we're in a world of trade-off, tell us that in the case of a trade-off, it's going to look at the magnitude of the errors in both of them. It's going to look at the persistence in the errors in both of them. And it's certainly not going to wait until maximum employment to lift off in a world where monetary policy has an effect that can take a year and a year and a half to matter, and inflation is much more than moderately exceeding 2%. Third and fourth recommendations are to accelerate the taper and be done with asset purchases by March. And then, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy right now, a huge amount of uncertainty. And I think what the Fed should do isn't raise rates in the December meeting, but it should set a new default. To date, it said, we think inflation's under control, we think inflation is going away, but if that's wrong, we'll revisit. Instead, say something more like, we're getting closer on maximum employment, our inflation deviation is larger than we thought it was, and so our expectation is that we're raising rates. I would set that expectation for a liftoff in the first half of the year, a total of 3 hikes in 2022, not wedded to the exact specifics of that, but wedded to something that says we'll call it off if, team transitory ends up being right and we have lower inflation, or if something like a surge of the virus leads the economy back into trouble with lower employment. The strange irony of the framework is it started out by moving away from forecasts. The concern was that in 2015, there wasn't actually inflation. There was just a model that said there would be inflation. And so the Fed lifted off because of that. Well, now the Fed is back in the world of forecasts. It's saying, we are forecasting inflation is going to go away. And because we forecast inflation is going to go away, we're not lifting off. All of these recommendations in some ways would move back closer to the framework. We've hit flexible average inflation target on a backward-looking basis, on a forward-looking basis. Any way you want to measure it, we're there. And you want to wait till you actually see inflation rather than use a model. Well, we're seeing the inflation. I do think the Fed should raise its inflation target, but it should do it eventually. It should do it because the equilibrium interest rate has fallen. I think something like a 2 to 3% range or 3%. Adam, among others, helped convince me that you don't want to do this in the middle. A new framework was adopted last year. It's better to stick with that framework. There's going to be a review. This should be a part of it. Even with the steps I outlined, I expect inflation to stay elevated. I would not say, if the inflation rate's 3, would not say the Fed should cause a recession to get it back down to 2. But let's take these steps now. Finally, I want to talk about the risks of doing too much. And I want to do that because the risks of doing too little are really important. They're well understood, but there are also risks on the other side. The first is that with relatively inelastic supply, expansion is going more into prices than output and employment. I think that's roughly the situation we're in now, where Europe and the United States saw similar recoveries of real GDP, but very different prices. So largely real GDP was sort of where it was going to be coming out of the pandemic because demand was supported. People had enough money to spend this year. The difference is largely manifested in prices. So right now, the trade-off at the margin for expansionary policy is a bad one. You don't get a lot of output, you do get a lot of prices. Second is surprising inflation hurts real wage growth. Come back to that in a moment. But there's a big difference between steady inflation that's predictable, where nominal wages adjust, and surprise, which is arbitrary redistribution. Third is a hard landing with vulnerable workers the most. The Fed has very, very rightfully refocused and broadened its concerns about unemployment, not just looking at the aggregate rate, looking at, for example, the unemployment rate for Black Americans. Right now, though, we're in a situation where if you do something wrong in monetary policy, you are raising the chances of a recession. Recessions take millions and millions of jobs away from people. They hurt vulnerable workers the most. And why are they doing that? They would do that to make what is likely a relatively marginal improvement in the best case. Fourth, low interest rates themselves have risks. There's a set of people that never liked QE from the beginning. They said it was distorting asset markets, causing bubbles and the like. I thought that they overstated their case against QE and underappreciated that it's a cost-benefit analysis, that yes, indeed, financial stability is a cost of low for longer, but when you had inadequate fiscal policy in the last cycle, that was a cost well worth bearing for the much needed economic expansion. When you do the cost benefit analysis now, fiscal policy is playing a much bigger role than it did in the last cycle. It's continuing to play a big role. And so the risks of low interest rates become a greater concern. I've been pushing a fiscal expansion in part to take the pressure off monetary policy, so we don't need to have these low interest rates. And finally, I think the Fed probably is going to raise rates 3 times next year. My worry is that they're going to do that in a surprising and hasty manner rather than a well-telegraphed and well-prepared. So I would just rather not have a disconnect between expectation and policy because that causes unnecessary volatility. That is the set of thoughts I have on this topic. I want to end by saying I don't think this is easy. There's no one that's gotten everything right this year. In hindsight, monetary policymakers are definitely going to get things right. They should continue to err on the side of expansionary, but the recalibration I'm describing would still be very expansionary, just somewhat less so, and a better way to manage these very real downside risks.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a fabulous tour de force, pulling together so many threads with your customary clarity and your use of charts, and we're grateful to Billy for making that all possible. There's a lot of things to discuss. Let me start though by picking up on your last point. Just this remark about it's hard, it's difficult. Mervyn King a long time ago made the observation that when you're getting monetary policy largely right is when you should have the most excited debates, because then it's about the forecast and about interpreting stuff in real time. When the shocks take you far away from equilibrium or you've made a big mistake, then it's obvious and everyone goes the same way. So I very much commend you talking about it in that spirit, but it is striking, frankly, and I've said this to people in the FOMC and publicly, just how off the inflation forecasts were over the last year in the SEP, which, as you say, is a multi-headed beast, but it's not even like among the dots, there was a dot that was clearly erring on the side of high inflation. You've been a forecaster for the US government. What do you think, not in terms of motivation, but what do you think intellectually lay behind that kind of forecast? And what do you think is the way the Fed can talk about correcting that forecast, given the bar chart you gave about the unrealistic lack of updates as 2021 unfolded?
Yeah, so I think there, broadly speaking, been 3 problems. One is everyone's standard errors have been too small. If you look at the survey of professional forecasters as recently as I think it was June, they said there was less than a 1 in 100 chance of inflation above 4% this year. You know, based on the craziness we were already seeing by that point in time, that was an absurd standard error. So overconfidence. The second one is an overemphasis on micro and an underemphasis on macro. Sometimes people just didn't believe our models. We did in the first half of this year, 15% of GDP in fiscal stimulus. People have multipliers for fiscal stimulus that are 0.5, 1, 1.5. In fact, most of the enthusiasts for fiscal stimulus had high multipliers. So if you're, use a multiplier of 0.5, and you added 7.5 to GDP, an economy that was operating, at most 4% below its potential in the fourth quarter of last year, of course you were going to get inflation. Same thing on monetary policy. It's almost like they don't believe that their monetary policy matters. It's almost like they don't believe it's a powerful tool because it's set to this very, very expansionary setting that's going to continue to have repercussions. So thinking about what the overall demand is, the lagging supply, and the mismatch. Finally, on the micro side, I think there has also been a little bit of the form, if you take out everything that's high, the inflation rate is lower. And that's always true. It is always the case that if you trim out the top 15% of price increases, the inflation rate goes down. But there's other things moving the opposite directions. You had people pointing to median CPI or median PCE earlier in the year saying it was lower than the core. Well, now it's higher than the core because inflation really has broadened out. And that's what you'd expect from a macro perspective. People have more money. You don't quite know where they're going to spend on the additional money. You just know it's going to happen somewhere.
Jason, that's a great set of things. But there has been a bunch of pushback on the idea that the fiscal is the source of the overheating. Even though you, Olivier, Larry, and I and others have been talking about that since American Rescue Plan came out. And part of it is to say that even though unemployment's moved a lot, the actual amount of real GDP growth or even nominal GDP growth hasn't been that huge. I mean, as you pointed out, the growth rate isn't that much different in the US than in Europe, you said. And that we're not seeing a huge upward tick in demand for services. So this to me is one of the key points I'd like to get your elucidation on. So yes, we can all make fun of the people who decide that used car prices are key, and if you take used car prices out, somehow you have low inflation. But there are a bunch of very solid charts out there showing that we've so far in the US had primarily a huge surge in goods inflation and almost no surge in services inflation. And at one point in your slides, you are forecasting, or you're saying at least an upside risk for inflation continuing into 2022 and 2023, is that there will be a pickup in services demand and services inflation. So could you talk a little bit more about how you interpret that breakdown and why the people saying, look, it's all bottlenecks, it's all supply micro, not because it's used cars, but because we see it so much in goods, not services.
Yeah, so why don't I take on the goods versus services one? Partly there's been a shift, but partly there's been an increase. The shift is people are buying more gym equipment and buying fewer gym memberships. There's also been an increase. Look at food. People have returned to restaurants and have continued spending money at a very high level in supermarkets above what they were doing before. I don't quite understand why that's happening, but it is. And the biggest shortfall on the service side is spending on health. And that isn't a shift story. It's not like you're shifting from health to something else. So that's the biggest laggard on the health side, on the service side. So in nominal terms, obviously spending's gone up quite a lot. Let's say your model of the world is there are only 10 widgets out there to buy, and you give somebody $1 billion, and widget sales don't go up any, it's still 10, just like it was last year. And you say, oh, look, see, real widget sales didn't go up. Why do you think demand mattered? Well, the problem is the supply curve is very vertical, and so it all showed up in prices. And so I think some of the people pointing to real numbers are making that mistake. On the goods versus services, I'd say three things. One is I do at least partially agree. It's part of why I think we will have lower inflation next year than this year. Second, from a macro perspective, if car prices go up and people don't have a lot of money, they'll cut back their spending elsewhere and other prices will fall. And so it'll change relative prices. The fact that we gave people a lot of money meant car prices could go up and other prices could continue to go up. So some of the goods versus services is about relative prices, not the price level, and all my macro analysis. And then finally, yeah, the biggest thing in services is housing, at least in the CPI, not in the PCE. That's going to rise quite a lot over the next year. There's other parts of services which have been temporarily depressed by Delta in the last couple of months. Airfares and hotels are down. They're certainly going to go back to where they were in July or August, probably above that too. So there's other shoes left to drop on the service side.
I try to mute when you're talking, sorry. So let's turn now for a moment to wages. And again, obviously we've seen a big surge in nominal wages, and as you've pointed out, among others, not so big in real wages. It looks like on the data that the lowest income quartile or quintile is getting actually still on net real wage increases, even if the upper quartiles or quintiles are not. We spoke a lot, we meaning the whole community of macro, including the Fed leadership, through the years about the benefits of the hot economy and finally getting wage expansion. And this rare situation we have now where relative wages are rising as well as real wages for the bottom part of the income distribution. So what are the risks and concerns that we shouldn't just keep pushing it? I mean, this is a very big policy goal, the one that you've advocated for. So are we getting nervous too soon?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just show you the data. I'll reshare. And this is consistent with what you just said. The orange bars are the real growth that we've seen by wage quartile. This is using the Atlanta Fed 12-month changes. So I have to do October to October. And you do indeed see a sizable, meaningful gain for the lowest quartile. The top two have lost. The second one gained, but that gain was probably between October and February. I don't have the seasonally adjusted data. They don't present it, so I wouldn't place much weight on it. But note, even for the lowest quartile, the gain is much smaller than the pace they were on in the 2 years prior to October 2019. And so even for the bottom quartile, I think you have roughly the same story, which is that the experience in the late 90s, maybe I should have left that up for people who don't process this quickly, but the experience, here, I'll put it back up. The experience in the late 1990s and the experience prior to COVID, to me, says you can keep pushing. You can have your unemployment rate fall by half, 7/10 a year. That will have these real benefits. But if you throw all the logs on the fire at once and you get a lot of unexpected inflation in the process, then you end up with this situation where it's not as good as it was before. And then the other thing I'd say is this lowest quartile of workers, they're the ones whose jobs are most threatened if there is a financial crisis, if there is, if there is a hard landing.
What are we to think about the idea that there may be not just a hot economy, but a restructuring economy, right? So, and particularly in the labor sense. I mean, so there's all the journalism about the Great Resignation. There's talk about reservation wages rising for American workers. There seems to be surprisingly a bunch of people opting out of manufacturing employment. If this is part of an ongoing restructuring of the labor market, Is that an argument, notwithstanding what you just said, is that an argument for keeping policy loose? Is there something that should be being done on the fiscal side as a result of that? Or is this just separate from monetary policy decisions to worry about that?
If I believed the Great Resignation, I think I would be more concerned about the need for a recalibration. Effectively, monetary policy, you don't want monetary policy to try incredibly hard to get a job for someone that doesn't necessarily even want a job. If you have a 60-year-old who just went through this experience, got some extra cash, their 401k went up, they've decided to retire early. If you heat things enough, they'll come back. I don't think we should be creating a lot of risk of throwing millions of people out of work because of a hard landing in the future in order to get that type of person back into work. Now, just to be clear, there's a lot of different types of people back in work. I picked one that's emblematic of one of the Great Resignation stories and said, to the degree you think the Great Resignation is an important part of the story, I'd be less worried about labor force participation. I'd be more worried about constraints on supply going forward. So I'd be more worried about inflation going forward. All that being said, I tend to think that I discount cultural changes and believe more in some transitory thing coming out of the virus in terms of depression and anxiety, in terms of people having extra cash. If you know there's going to be jobs a couple months from now because the labor market's so hot, why not wait a couple extra months to take a job? So if I had to do my best guess, it will be that the labor market will get back. It might take a year or two, but the problems are supply, not demand. The Fed can't solve that problem. If it tries to, it'll only make things worse.
So let's talk for a moment about labor force participation. I mean, clearly, and you pointed this out at various times, that the elasticity of labor supply and the elasticity of particular segments of labor supply in the US, older workers versus younger workers, industrial workers versus service workers or health workers, is a critical determinant of both well-being and inflation. The Fed has a history repeatedly of underestimating how far you can get back to on labor force participation after a setback. So I would have argued, and I did at the time, that the mistake in 2014-15 was being too unambitious about getting back to a high level of labor force participation. You just sounded reasonably optimistic on labor force participation. So leaving aside the implications for Fed policy, what should we be aspiring to, and what does this tell us about for Fed policy going forward about, when you're setting a dual mandate, what role should labor force participation as opposed to, say, unemployment play?
Yeah. So, and you and Danny Blanchflower got this much more right than I did in 2015. I overstated the amount of it that was structural, the decline in labor force participation, and underappreciated how much it could rise if you strengthen the economy. I think just like with wages, the lesson there wasn't necessarily that we could have gotten the economy to the February 2020 EPOP 5 years earlier. It just was that there was always more room to move. It's possible that if you ex post graded the 2015 to 2020 experience pre-pandemic, you'd give it a grade of a 90. And if you had done something perfectly, you could have gotten better, but you also could have completely messed it up and made it a lot worse. So I think it's a justification of a one log on a fire at a time, hot economy theory, not all logs at once. For labor force participation, I distinguish two things: how you want to use it as an input into predicting inflation, and how much of an objective it is in its own right. I think it's an important input into predicting inflation because it tells you, is there more slack than you think there actually is? An objective in its own right, I have a mixed view about that. Partly, I think, yes, you want to take people that have been discouraged and get them undiscouraged and excited again. But if a 62-year-old has decided they want to, stay retired rather than unretire, if a 41-year-old decides they want to spend more time with their children and they just rethought their life in the last year and They appreciate time with children much more than they did before. I don't know if the Fed wants to do that. So we know the unemployment rate should be low. I don't know what the optimal labor force participation rate is.
Great. Just a little bit further on labor force, and then I'm going to turn international and then finally to your policy recommendations. Thank you for being so willing to go into the thinking behind your arguments. Larry Summers, in his op-ed earlier this week on inflation past time for transitory to stand down, talks about ominous employment cost index increases and the worry about switchers of jobs getting double-digit pay increases. Paul Krugman, in a Twitter thread today, in part in response to your paper, points out that in his view, labor market tightness seems to be only a modest contributor to overall inflation so far. I'm not asking you to adjudicate their different views, although it would be nice if somebody did. But my main point is you're all mentioning wages, and the word productivity doesn't seem to come up at all. And normally in central banking as well as economics, part of how you decide what's a reasonable wage growth is what's the productivity growth rate. And so I just want to push you a bit why the word productivity is not appearing. Is it just that the productivity numbers are so screwy in this 2-year period of post-pandemic? Is it that we don't know? And secondly, just more broadly, what you have said at times, I think, that you think potential growth may be lower post-pandemic for the US than it was. How much of that do you think is a labor story versus a productivity story?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree. In theory, one wants to judge wage increases relative to productivity. Productivity numbers are always squirrely at a quarterly frequency. I think in Q3, productivity was something like -10% at an annual rate. Don't fact check me on that. In Q2, productivity was up a lot at an annual rate. And you also see productivity over the course of the whole pandemic up a decent amount in the United States, but down in Europe. And I don't think there's a big technological difference between the United States and Europe. I think we didn't retain as many workers. And so the ones we have left, we're running them to the bone to produce the stuff people want. Europe retained its workers. And if anything, it's seen a productivity decline because it's doing the opposite. It has sort of more people than it has customers. So the numbers of the last year or two tell you more, I think, about temporary labor intensity, for example, than they do about something long-term. Long-term, I see more of a narrative that's a negative for productivity than a positive. Just the foregone business investment over the last year and a half adds up to about 2% of the capital stock. Put that in a standard production function, that's about half a point off the level of productivity. We've had some de-skilling of workers who have been out of jobs, haven't gotten the training over the last year and a half, some persistent worsening in education that is resulting in this. I think some of the hardening against COVID is going to cost us. Now, on the other side, there's work from home, less business travel. Whether we think all of that is a plus or a minus for productivity, I don't know. The magnitude could be quite large in either way, but sort of the experience would tell us this is all bad for productivity. There's a bit of a hope that there's something completely different about this one, which ushered in Zoom and the like, but I'd sort of go with experience over hope as my base case.
Thank you. You mentioned Europe, and obviously we at the Peterson Institute, work by Jean Pisani-Ferry and others, we've been very interested in this idea of the European approach to benefits and unemployment versus the American approach. And I appreciate you bringing that in. But I think it's now time to sort of go larger picture. It has been interesting in the Twitter sphere, in reporting, there's been a lot of comparisons back and forth about the inflation rates in US and Europe. You had a slide up earlier suggesting that US measured like-for-like inflation, HICP, which is the Euro area's inflation target measure, was running, I think you said, about 2% higher in the US. Others have been putting up charts claiming that no, actually the difference is not that big, or that it's got more to do with just where we are in the cycle. So could you expand a bit about why there seems to be confusion and I don't mean people's motivation, but clarifying against confusion on this point? Why do you feel comfortable saying that there is a message there that the US is running above and beyond the bottleneck inflation, supply inflation that's common to Europe and Japan?
So there's two different questions. One is the fact, and the second is the interpretation. I think the fact is crystal clear. As you noted, I like to use HICP for both, because that's methodologically consistent. I'd rather use the CPI for Europe and the CPI for us, but they don't have, they don't do the translation that way. And you know, one of the things, sometimes people show the 1-year changes. So you look at Germany, they've had a decent amount of inflation over the last 12 months. That's because they had a temporary VAT reduction last year. So they had more deflation last year. They've had more inflation this year. That's why it's really important to look over 24 months. You don't want to just, they got rid of the VAT, they got more inflation, take that into account. So some of it is 12-month changes versus 24-month changes. And the data is not seasonally adjusted. Otherwise, I'd anchor the beginning of the pandemic. A second is, using the US CPI. The US CPI is lower than the HICP because shelter has actually held down inflation over the last year and a half, and that shows up in the CPI, not the HICP. So I think there's technical things. There's certain things you could do with the pre-trends, but the most clear transparent ones, and that's what I showed you, say there isn't actually much of a difference in the pre-trends on the comparable measure. There's then a second question, which is the interpretation. You know, it is the case that if you take out the things that have grown quickly in the United States, more than in Europe, you will narrow the difference between the two. So you take out used cars, you narrow the difference between the two. How valid is that? Well, you could take out things that went the other way and you'd make the difference larger. So there seems to be something like, why do you pick these things and not those things? And then there's the macro story that, you know, used cars are more expensive, but Americans could still afford to buy other stuff. So why do you assume the price of everything else won't be different? So some of the, it's all bottlenecks, it's all this, it's all that, to me feels like the type of cherry picking that led us astray a couple months ago in thinking about the time series trend within the United States itself.
Terrific. So in our remaining time, let me return to your 4 points enumerated about the policy shift that you're recommending for the Fed. And as you've very clearly stated, this is not a shift in framework. You believe this is, if anything, a updating, recalibration to get current policy settings in line with the new frame. But before we go there, you, our colleague Blanchard, our mutual colleague Summers, many others, and many on the opposing side seem to be fighting over basically 125 bips hike additional in 2022 and a couple months sooner tapering. This seems like a lot of Sturm und Drang for not very much policy difference. Do you put it, I mean, leaving aside the issue of, you know, if suddenly we get an unexpected huge inflation that we have to deal with, is there anybody out there, I don't mean you to name them, but is there a case for a more aggressive policy? Because this fight doesn't seem, or this, not fight, but this team transitory permit seems to be disputing over a relatively small adjustment in Fed policy.
Yeah, look, I am nervous that what I'm proposing is too expansionary. So you could much more easily persuade me that I should be talking about 4 or 5 hikes next year than you could that I should be talking about 1 or 2 hikes next year. The logic of the argument in terms of the shortfall from maximum employment, the deviation from inflation, what's happened to real rates, the costs later, I think all of that's quite large. But I'm also trying to start from where we are now. And monetary policy shouldn't sort of instantly, massively change, or at least it should try to avoid doing that. I mean, it did instantly, massively change in February 2020, and that was obviously a very good thing, an appropriate thing to have done. So you want an inertial rule. You want to place weight on where you are now and make adjustments away from it. And you don't want to terrify markets. So yeah, in some ways, I feel like I'm pulling my punches. But that's probably conditional on the set of expectations we have the right thing to do. And I'd say, it's still different. I mean, if you look at the Fed, I think they had one hike in the median in their dot plots, and there was a sense that that one hike itself was from rogue Reserve Bank presidents, and that the Board of Governors itself was continuing to try to say no hike in 2022. People don't believe them, but that's the message. So moving to 3 with liftoff in the first half of the year, that would be a pretty strong signal of difference from where we've been. But I agree, not marking all the way to my analysis of where the economy is.
Just thank you for that. And just pursuing one more step on the rate hikes question. One thing which I've tried to challenge people with is what one thinks the needed Fed hike would be to contain inflationary pressures. And you seem to be saying, minimum of 75 in the next year and a little more. Of course, the more we think about inflation expectations and the more people say the 70s are relevant, the more someone gets pushed to thinking, well, the Fed would actually have to get real interest rates at least to 0 to change things. I mean, as you keep pointing out, the actual real interest rate as measured in the TIPS market right now is very, very low. And even if inflation cuts back some, and even if the Fed were to hike 75, you probably still have a negative real rate under the scenarios you're talking about, probably. So, I mean, how should the Fed be thinking about what is the amount that they need to hike? Should we be thinking possibly that we do need positive real interest rates at some point?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's sort of the errors on both sides. If we ended up 3 years from now and inflation was steadily 2.8%, that would mean a big miss for the Fed relative to what they expected, a perfectly fine miss, and unemployment rate was good, there were no asset market bubbles, real rates were positive. I'd count that as a success. And I'd ask you if I could put together a paper and a talk here about why we should lock in the 2.8% inflation. We're very, very far from that point right now, but I'm not, this is not like we need to create a recession to whip inflation and get it back to 2%. That probably was needed in the late 70s. This is about avoiding that situation. In terms of a benchmark for real rates, yes, I would much rather see real rates go positive than negative. There's much more of a shot of that on the long end where it matters more. We're not going to see real rates on the short end for for a while, and the equilibrium Fed funds rate in real terms may actually be something very close to 0. That's not, I don't think, though, the equilibrium 10-year rate. But could that be half a point? Maybe. I don't. So I don't feel some need to target that, especially with the uncertainty around what that equilibrium or neutral real rate is.
Thank you so much, Jason. This has been terrific. Terrific for our audience, terrific for the public discussion, terrific for the members of the FOMC who I'm sure are listening, I know are listening and interacting, and terrific as an example of how to take through conflicting data, conflicting views, the Twitterverse, which you're a good master of, and still turn it into something that is a solid line of argument with clear humility about where there is uncertainty. On behalf of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and our global audience, I'd like to thank Jason Furman today for taking us through his latest elaboration of what the Federal Reserve should do now and why. Jason is, of course, the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Adam. Great discussion.